Judge insults black woman, but is shocked when she shows a badge and orders an arrest. The morning air was thick with the kind of southern humidity that clung to everything, even in early spring. Fulton County Courthouse loomed over downtown Atlanta like a relic of another era. Its limestone walls streaked with age, the iron gates creaking with the daily march of justice. Inside, the rhythm was as predictable as it was indifferent. A bailiff calling names, defendants shuffling forward, lawyers juggling paperwork, and Judge Richard Callahan presiding with a stern face of man who considered mercy a weakness. Michelle Carter stepped through the courthouse doors at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. She wore a plain navy blue blouse tucked neatly into beige slacks, her natural hair pulled back into a low bun. Nothing about her appearance screamed authority. She carried no briefcase, no files, no visible badge. She could have been mistaken for a social worker or maybe someone attending a family member's hearing. In fact, as she moved through the metal detectors and past the murmuring crowd, no one gave her a second glance, except for Judge Callahan. He noticed at the moment she entered the courtroom and took a seat in the second row, just behind the bar that separated the general public from court officers and attorneys. It wasn't just that she sat closer than most spectators dared. It was the way she observed the room, silent but attentive, her eyes scanning not just the judge, but the clerks, the security officers, and the defense table. She looked like someone who had come for a reason. Callahan's gaze hardened. His eyes, a pale blue that rarely blinked when reprimanding defendants, narrowed as he shifted slightly in his high-backed chair. He was a man used to control, a former prosecutor turned judge who had built his reputation on order, authority, and an unyielding belief that rules must be followed. His rules, most of all. Michelle didn't flinch under his stare. She crossed one leg over the other, rested her hands on her lap, and waited. The morning docket proceeded as usual. Petty theft, domestic disputes, minor probation violations. Michelle remained silent, unflinching, until a bailiff called for recess and the courtroom emptied briefly. Still, she didn't move. Her posture remained poised, her presence calm but unyielding. She was not there for someone else's case. She was there for something else entirely. By the time the courtroom reconvened, Michelle's presence had been noted by more than just the judge. The defense attorney glanced over his shoulder curiously. A clerk whispered something to another as they exchanged glances. A young man at the back, clearly a friend or relative of a defendant, leaned forward, eyes fixed on her. No one recognized her, but everyone sensed she didn't belong, at least not in the way they were used to. And that was precisely why she was there. Michelle Carter had been in courtrooms all over the country, some grand and federal, others small and forgotten. But this was her first time at Fulton County Courthouse in an unofficial capacity. She had arrived early, just as she always did, to observe without interference. She wanted to feel the room, listen to how people were treated, see the unspoken dynamics at play. Her training had taught her that truth wasn't just found in documents and testimonies. It was in body language, in tone, in silence. She knew the judge's reputation. Richard Callahan had never been formally accused of misconduct, but whispers followed him like a shadow. Disparities in sentencing, unusually harsh treatment of defendants of color, and a pattern of dismissing claims from minority attorneys and court staff. Nothing proven, nothing official, but enough for someone to take a closer look. Michelle had drawn the assignment 6 weeks ago. Her orders had been clear: observe, report, and remain covert unless provoked or compromised. She had done just that, until now. What Michelle could not have predicted was that her mere presence would provoke more than suspicion. It would provoke a confrontation that would change the course of the day in the court entirely. For now, though, she waited, hands folded, heart steady. She was not a woman who rushed. Her job required precision, patience, and the ability to remain invisible until the moment came to be seen. And that moment was fast approaching. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked past 10 o'clock in the morning when the bailiff called the next case. The shuffle of feet, the clearing of throats, the soft click of keyboards from the clerks filled the room. Michelle remained still in her seat near the front, her eyes calm but unwavering, her presence unshaken by the noise around her. She blended in, but at the same time, she commanded attention simply by not moving, not reacting. That restraint seemed to unnerve Judge Callahan more than anything. He cleared his throat, leaning forward slightly. The robe draped over his shoulders gave him the usual gravitas, but his eyes betrayed a sharp irritation. He was used to this space being entirely his. A courtroom, in his mind, was like a stage, and he the sole conductor. Every lawyer, every defendant, every officer moved to his rhythm. Now there was someone disrupting that rhythm just by sitting too close, too observant, too silent. When the defendant at the stand hesitated to answer a question, Callahan snapped at him and then, almost instinctively, his gaze cut once more to Michelle. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't looked away. And that, to him, was enough to consider it defiance. He let the case move along, but it was clear his patience was waning. The murmurs among the audience grew. People noticed attention, though they could not yet define its cause. Finally, Callahan interrupted the proceedings. His voice, smooth but edged with sarcasm, cut across the room. "Ma'am," he said, directing his words at Michelle. The sudden silence that fell was thick. "Are you lost? That area is not meant for the general public. It is reserved for officers of the court, attorneys, or those with a direct role in today's hearings." His words carried the weight of command, but the tone was designed to sting. It was less an inquiry than a performance, less curiosity than a statement meant to humiliate. The room reacted instantly. A low wave of whispers rolled through the benches. Some people glanced at Michelle with pity, others with intrigue. The defense attorney, a man in a gray suit with thinning hair, looked down at his notes as if to avoid being drawn into the exchange. A young woman sitting at the back of the gallery nudged her friend, whispering something behind a raised hand. All eyes, however, eventually returned to Michelle. She remained seated for a moment longer, her face composed. Callahan, not receiving the immediate apology or retreat he expected, pressed further. "This is not a space for spectators who want a closer view of the drama," he added, the corners of his mouth tightening in a smirk. "If you like to watch, the back rows are open. Unless, of course, you mistaken this place for some sort of public theater." The chuckles of two men at the far side of the gallery echoed louder than they should have. Michelle finally rose to her feet, her movement deliberate and unhurried. The air seemed to shift with her. She was not tall, but she carried herself with an authority that made her seem unshakable. Her gaze fixed firmly on the judge, though she said nothing. That silence alone was louder than any protest. The bailiff stepped forward, uncertain. His hand hovered near the radio on his belt, as if awaiting instruction. Callahan took the hesitation as an opening to tighten his grip on the moment. "Officer," he said to the bailiff, his tone dry, "I believe this woman is confused about where she belongs. Escort her back or out, whichever seems most fitting." The bailiff hesitated again, glancing at Michelle. Something about her stance, the steadiness in her eyes, told him this was not a simple case of a member of the public overstepping boundaries. Still, protocol demanded he follow the judge's order. He took a careful step closer to her. The tension was thick enough to taste. Michelle did not move back. She did not explain herself. She let the silence linger until even the murmurs in the courtroom died away. Every face turned toward her, waiting for the inevitable. Her exit, perhaps a protest, maybe even a breakdown under the public pressure of humiliation. But instead, she simply straightened her shoulders, her calm radiating through the air like an unseen shield. The seconds dragged. Callahan's smirk faltered slightly, though he masked it with a frown meant to look authoritative. "Do I need to repeat myself, ma'am?" His voice was sharper now, tinged with the impatience of a man unaccustomed to being ignored. Michelle met his eyes and, without raising her voice, finally spoke. "No, Your Honor," she said evenly, her tone stripped of emotion, yet carrying a strength that silenced the room even further. "I heard you." Her words hung there, unyielding. They weren't an apology. They weren't defiance in the obvious sense either. They were acknowledgement without surrender, a refusal to be belittled. The bailiff froze in place, uncertain whether to proceed. Callahan shifted in his chair, the flush on his neck betraying the irritation clawing at him. He opened his mouth to speak again, but for a moment, even he seemed uncertain what to say. The courtroom had become an arena. One man in robes and gavel, one woman standing silently, and an entire audience holding its breath. The balance of power, usually so clear and unquestionable in this space, felt suddenly fragile, as though the slightest gesture could topple in one direction or the other. Callahan finally leaned back, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Then perhaps you should explain yourself," he said, his sarcasm thinly veiled now by a sheen of forced calm. "What business brings you to the front rows of my courtroom today?" Michelle didn't answer right away. She let the question linger, her silence deliberate, her poise unbroken. Around her, the weight of expectation grew unbearable for everyone else, though she herself seemed immune to it. Then, finally, with a subtle motion, she placed her hands at her sides and prepared to speak again. Michelle stood tall, her presence filling the courtroom in a way that words never could. The judge's demand for explanation had left the space hanging with expectation, but she did not immediately comply. Instead, she let the weight of silence stretch, each second drawing the room tighter, until even the restless shuffling of paper ceased. She did not fidget, did not break eye contact. Her silence was not ignorance. It was calculated, deliberate. The audience grew restless. A woman in the back coughed nervously. A man leaned forward as though about to whisper, but stopped himself, sensing that this moment belonged to forces larger than idle commentary. The bailiff, still frozen mid-step, glanced toward the judge, then back to Michelle, uncertain whether to act without further instruction. Callahan's fingers drummed impatiently on the bench. He was not a man accustomed to silence, at least not silence that he did not control. In his court, silence was submission. Defendants too scared to speak, attorneys too wise to argue. But this was different. This silence was defiance dressed in composure. It unsettled him more than any outburst could have. "Ma'am," he said again, this time his voice lower, more clipped, like a warning before a storm. "This is a court of law, not a place for stunts. If you will not explain yourself, I will consider your presence disruptive. And I assure you, I do not tolerate disruption." Michelle's gaze remained steady. She finally shifted slightly, a small tilt of her head, as if acknowledging his words without yielding to them. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but she closed them again, deliberately withholding. It was a gesture so subtle, so restrained, that it drew more attention than a shouted retort could have. The tension broke only when an older man, sitting 3 rows back, whispered audibly, "She's not moving." The sound was like a match in dry grass. The courtroom buzzed with whispers again, the restrained hum of speculation and disbelief. Callahan slammed his gavel once, the crack sharp enough to jolt the audience into silence. "Enough," he snapped. His composure was slipping, and he knew it. He leaned forward, his pale eyes boring into Michelle. "You will either speak, or you will be removed. I will not ask a third time." The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, but remained where he was. Even he could sense the imbalance, the wrongness of the command. He was trained to follow orders, but training also taught him to read a room, to know when a situation was not what it seemed. Something about Michelle's stance, her refusal to bend, made it clear this was no ordinary spectator. Michelle finally moved, but only to lift her chin slightly higher, her hands still at her sides. Her silence was no longer just refusal, it was a statement. She was forcing him to expose himself, to reveal the impatience, the arrogance, the assumption of superiority that had long gone unchecked. The entire courtroom was witnessing it, and with every passing second, Callahan was the one who looked smaller. The defendant at the stand, a young man in his 20s accused of minor parole violation, turned his head slowly to watch. His lawyer, though attempting to appear unaffected, was biting his lip, his knuckles white as he gripped his pen. Even the clerk at the corner desk, usually indifferent to the parade of hearings, kept sneaking glances at Michelle, her eyes wide. For the first time in years, Judge Richard Callahan felt something rare in his courtroom: the erosion of control. He leaned back, his robe rustling against the leather of his chair, and forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Very well," he said coldly. "If you will not respect this court with an answer, then you will leave it in the custody of my officers." He gestured toward the bailiff. "Remove her." The bailiff swallowed hard, hesitating for a heartbeat longer before stepping forward again. He approached Michelle carefully, as though she were not just a woman in the wrong seat, but something else entirely, something untouchable. The murmurs began anew, hushed but urgent, as the audience sensed they were witnessing a moment unlike any routine case. Michelle's silence deepened with every step the bailiff took. She did not flinch. She did not shift her weight. Her eyes locked on the judge, her posture unbroken. She seemed carved from stone. The bailiff paused just an arm's length away, his uncertainty clear in the way he avoided touching her. He glanced at the judge once more, waiting for absolute confirmation. "Do your job," Callahan barked, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the irritation bubbling beneath his judicial facade. The bailiff raised his hand reluctantly, about to make contact with her arm. That was the moment Michelle finally moved, one small step forward, smooth and deliberate. She did not retreat. She advanced, just enough to stop the bailiff in his tracks. Her silence in that motion was deafening. The entire courtroom inhaled sharply as though they all shared a single breath. Callahan's jaw tightened. For a flicker of a second, uncertainty flashed across his face, quickly smothered by arrogance. He would not, could not, be undermined in his own court. His voice boomed once more, though it carried a trace of something unfamiliar. Unease. This is your final warning. Either you speak or you're removed by force. Michelle, still silent, let her gaze sweep briefly over the crowd before returning to him. The power had shifted entirely. What began as an insult, a dismissal, had become a theater of authority reversed. Her silence had said more than words ever could. She would not be diminished, and she would not bend. And in that silence, the stage was set for the revelation to come. The bailiff's fingers hovered a breath from Michelle's sleeve when she moved. Not backward, not in retreat, but forward with the quiet confidence of someone finally done granting courtesy. Her right hand slid into the inner pocket of her blazer, a motion measured enough to keep the bailiff from flinching and decisive enough to command the room. She drew out a worn leather credential case, folded once, and opened it cleanly so the gold and blue shield and the laminated identification faced the bench under the full glare of the courtroom lights. Her voice carried without strain. Special Agent Michelle Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The letters seemed to ricochet off the wood-paneled walls. Several people gasped, and one of the clerks let a stack of forms slip and fan across the floor. The bailiff stumbled a half-step back, hand dropping from a radio, eyes locked on the federal seal as though it might burn him if he blinked. Michelle did not raise the badge above her shoulder or wave it. She simply held it at chest height, steady as a metronome, so there could be no doubt. Judge Callahan's mouth opened before his mind caught up, and what came out first was not authority, but surprise. He recovered quickly, lifting his chin as if he could see down on her from a greater height. "Agent Carter," he said, emphasizing her title as if it were a decorum he could weaponize. "You're still out of order. Federal badge or not, you will not disrupt my courtroom with theatrics." Michelle's eyes moved to the court reporter. "Madam Reporter," she said, tone even and professional, "please mark the record to reflect my identification and the judge's instruction immediately following it." The court reporter's fingers found the keys, and for a moment the soft clatter sounded like rain on a tin roof. Then Michelle looked to the bailiff. "Officer, stand down." It was not a request. The bailiff's shoulders instinctively squared to attention. Training was muscle memory. The cadence of federal command nestled neatly into his years of drill deference. He lowered his hands to his sides and stepped away without protest. Whispers rose like steam from a gallery. A young woman in a mustard cardigan pressed her hands together, eyes bright with relief she could not quite articulate. A public defender near the front bit back a grin. He allowed a bloom only on one side of his face. The prosecutor glanced at the judge and then at Michelle, calculating where the wind had shifted and how sharp its edge would be. Callahan reached for the gavel and struck once. The sound rang hard and brittle. "This court will have order." He paused, measuring his next line as though it might stitch the edges of his authority back together. "Agent Carter, if you have business here, you will present it through proper channels, not by planting yourself in restricted seating like a spectator angling for spectacle." Michelle closed credential case with a soft click and slipped it into her pocket, but she did not return to her seat. She remained standing, posture composed, eyes level. Your Honor, my business here is official. I arrived early to observe court operations in the ordinary course of a federal civil rights inquiry. I did not address the court until addressed by it. The supposed disruption began with your commentary on my presence and your instruction to remove me. Callahan leaned forward, the leather of his chair whispering against his robe. Is the Federal Bureau of Investigation so short on manners that its agents ambush judges during morning docket? His tone carried casual derision, with a polished edge that had cut many before. Respectfully, Michelle replied, and the word did not bend. Nothing about my presence is an ambush. I am here pursuant to an ongoing investigation into conduct occurring under color of law. I am prepared to discuss details with counsel in a suitable setting. In the meantime, I will ask that you refrain from directing court officers to remove a federal agent who is lawfully present. The last phrase landed with the weight of a statute book. The prosecution table shifted. The assistant district attorney, a man with steady hands and cautious eyes, adjusted his tie as if it had become too tight. He addressed the bench carefully. Your Honor, if there is a federal matter intersecting with today's docket, the state would prefer clarity to avoid tainting the record. Clarity. The word cut to the room's humidity. Callahan's jaw flexed once. He was a man who understood the granularity of power, who had it, how it moved, and how to reclaim it. He straightened and adopted a tone of magnanimity that did not reach his eyes. Very well. Agent Carter, you will deliver whatever letter or notice your office intend for me, and you will do so without further disrupting proceedings. We have defendants waiting. Michelle nodded once. I will provide written notice momentarily. She glanced at the aisle, where a deputy from courthouse security, older, with a stripe on his sleeve and the aura of a supervisor, had stepped in, drawn by the courtroom's change in temperature. He took one look at the identification still fresh in everyone's minds and gave her a crisp nod. Sergeant, the documentation is with my colleague in the corridor outside. Would you kindly retrieve Agent Rollins and bring the envelope labeled Judicial Notice Fulton? Yes, ma'am. The sergeant answered before habit could be overridden by local politics. He slipped out. The door side closed behind him, and the audience exhaled as a single creature. Callahan toyed with the gavel, tapping it lightly, measuring. In the interim, he said, adopting a tone that aspired to boredom, we will proceed with the next case. Counsel, call your matter. But nothing in the room moved toward normal. The next defendant did not stand. The clerk did not call a case. Everyone remained tuned to the frequency of the moment, the way one leans toward a radio half filled with static, waiting for the signal to cut clean. The judge's nostrils flared. Clerk, he insisted. The clerk glanced at Michelle and then at the judge. Her voice came out thin. Your Honor, in light of a federal agent identifying an intersection with today's proceedings, I believe it would be prudent to confer. The sentence was dressed in deference, but carried a practical backbone. The door opened again, and the sergeant returned with a black woman in a tailored charcoal suit whose expression could have been carved from granite. She carried a large manila envelope tucked under one arm and a leather portfolio in the other. She approached the well and paused at the bar. Agent Vanessa Rollins, Federal Bureau of Investigation, she announced, then held the envelope up slightly. Judicial notice for the presiding judge. Bring it, Callahan said. The syllables clipped. The sergeant crossed the rail, obtained the envelope, and delivered it to the bench. Callahan slid it with a letter opener that had once belonged to his grandfather, a reminder of legacy he polished in private. He withdrew a formal letter on Department of Justice letterhead and several attachments. As his eyes scanned the text, a flush crept up his neck that protocol could not conceal. Michelle did not watch him read. She watched the room, the way people held themselves now, heads a little higher, shoulders a little looser, as if a new law of gravity were being tested. She spoke only when Callahan set the letter down. For the record, Your Honor, the notice advises that the United States is conducting a civil rights investigation regarding potential patterns and practices implicating equal protection under the 14th Amendment and the federal statute concerning deprivation of rights under color of law. The letter further requests non-interference with assigned agents while observing court operations and instructs that any inquiry be directed to the United States Attorney's Office. Callahan lifted his gaze slowly, the gavel motionless in his hand. "Is there a subpoena in this menagerie?" he asked dryly. "A preservation request," Agent Rollins said, voice level. She had taken a place beside Michelle with the seamless poise of someone who had walked point in dozens of rooms like this. Immediate retention of audio, video, transcripts, emails, calendars, and internal correspondence related to scheduling and courtroom security directives, effective today and retroactive to a specified period. Additional legal instruments will follow as needed. The defense attorney from the earlier case rose halfway, thought better of it, then rose fully. "Your Honor, without intruding on the court's prerogatives, in light of this notice, the defense respectfully requests a brief recess to consult with our client regarding potential implications." For once, the prosecutor added, "the state is in agreement." Callahan's eyes returned to the letter. He was calculating routes. Full defiance, which would be quoted in headlines, reluctant cooperation, which would taste like ash, or performative compliance spiked with private resistance later. He pressed his lips together, then spoke in a register designed to suggest nothing had rattled him. "This court will take a brief recess." He rapped the gavel once, the sound less brittle this time, as a conceding tone without conceding ground. Before anyone could scatter, Michelle addressed the court reporter again. "Please mark that the recess follows federal notice and identification." The reporter nodded, fingers flickering across the keys. Michelle then turned to the sergeant. "Would you ensure that the hallway remains clear of unnecessary traffic while we exit? We will return documents to chambers following the break." "Yes, ma'am," the sergeant said, already moving. The gallery rose in waves, a rustle of fabric and softened chatter. Some eyes were bold with gratitude, others cautious with hope, and a few, older men in stiff suits, tight with resentment, held carefully behind neutral expressions. At the threshold, a young man in a wrinkled button-down caught Michelle's eye. He had been the one at the defense table earlier. Cheeks hollow by worry, fingers white-knuckled on a pen. He mouthed "thank you" without sound. Michelle gave the smallest nod, the kind that acknowledged a message without making a promise she could not ethically make. Callahan remained seated a moment longer, studying the letter as though he might find a typo that would unravel it. Then he stood, collecting his robe at the shoulders. 15 minutes, he said to the clerk, who had already started the timer on her phone, because that was what she did for every recess, even when time fell apart in other ways. He disappeared through the door behind the bench, the way judges do when the public world collides with the private one. In the corridor, fluorescent lights hummed, and the air smelled faintly of old wax and coffee. Agent Rollins handed Michelle a second envelope, thinner, stamped with a discreet seal. "For Chambers," Rollins said. "It outlines interview protocols. If he is smart, he will insist on counsel present. If he is not, record everything. He will be both," Michelle said, a small truth spoken without malice. "Smart enough to pretend he is in control, not smart enough to conceal the habit." They walked past framed photographs of past judges, a procession of stern faces, almost all of them white men in black robes, captured in the confident light of official portraits. Michelle felt a familiar mix of weariness and resolve that never fully left her. She had not come here to be applauded. She had come to a job that often left no one cheering. Only quieter rooms and, sometimes, the first breath of a different future. A public defender jogged up, a woman with tired eyes and a bright scarf knotted at her neck. "Agent Carter," she said under her breath, keeping judgmental ears from the words, "if the Bureau is looking at systemic practice, there are files you should see, not the ones anyone asks for, the ones never pulled. I cannot hand them to you, but I can tell you what to ask for. Put it in an email to the address on the notice," Michelle said. "Send nothing else. We will do the rest." The defender nodded and fell back, already drafting a message in her mind. A janitor stopped sweeping as they passed and dipped his head, unsure whether it was acknowledgement or habit. A pair of deputies straightened without meaning to. At the end of the hall, beneath a skylight that turned the corridor into a shallow well of pale midday, Agent Rollins slowed. "You handled it clean," she said. "He wanted a scene." You gave him a record. He gave it to himself, Michelle answered. She could still hear the judge's first question, "Are you lost?" ringing with that easy disdain. She let the echo fade. "We will need statements from staff." Quietly, the clerk with the auburn hair will talk if protected. The bailiff will not, but he will not lie if asked directly. Rollins jotted notes in the portfolio without looking down, the pen skimming as if it already knew the path. "We will set it up through the U.S. Attorney. Shield them with formal requests. Keep the pressure procedural." A deputy approached, hesitant. "Agent Carter," he said, rubbing a palm against his trouser seam. "The judge's clerk asked whether you intend to meet in chambers or coordinate through counsel." "She says he is," her words, eager to clarify the misunderstanding. Michelle studied the deputy's face for the tells of messenger contamination. He looked like a man who had delivered enough bad news to know the smell of it. "Tell her we will confer briefly in chambers to arrange the parameters. On the record, then all communications go through the U.S. Attorney's office." "Yes, ma'am." He pivoted, almost relieved to have an instruction he could carry without breaking it. Back inside the courtroom. The benches were mostly empty. The murmurs relocated to stairwells and text messages. The court reporter remained at her machine, shoulders squared, eyes calmer now. She watched Michelle re-enter with Agent Rollins and the sergeant a step behind, more escort than watchdog. At the clerk's desk, the timer blinked down from 10 minutes. The judge's door remained shut. Michelle paused at the rail and looked once more at the room. Not the architecture, but the people who wore like weather. The woman in the mustard cardigan had returned and retaken her seat, a stubbornness that felt like a small act of citizenship. The young man at the defense table leaned toward his lawyer, whispering, posture less clenched. The bailiff stood at his post, hand behind his back, eyes forward, an equation rewritten by a single line. When the judge finally emerged, he did so with a face curated into neutrality. He assumed the bench, lifted the letter again, and placed it to one side. "Agent Carter," he said, voice even, "the court will recess early for lunch for administrative reasons. We will confer in chambers for 10 minutes to address logistics and ensure my court complies with all lawful requests while maintaining the integrity of state proceedings." It was the closest he could come to a bow without bending. Michelle inclined her head once. "Acknowledge, Your Honor." She turned to the court reporter. "Please note the terms." Then to the clerk. "We will provide a copy of the notice to file." The clerk nodded, grateful to be given tasks that smelled of order. As the judge rose again, cloak of procedure rewrapped around his shoulders, the sergeant held the door to chambers. Michelle stepped through first, not out of entitlement, but because leadership sometimes meant entering the smallest rooms before anyone else. Behind her, the hum of the courthouse resumed, different now, as if someone had lifted a pane of glass from between voices and their intentions. The session would be suspended, the docket reshuffled, and every person who had occupied that room would carry away a memory of the moment the power dynamics shifted under fluorescent lights and old portraits. For Michelle, the embarrassment was not the point. The record was. The humiliation he felt belonged to him. The paper trail belonged to everyone. And as the door to chambers closed with a soft seal, she knew the quiet that followed would be more consequential than any gavel's crack. The door to chambers shut softly behind them, leaving the cavernous courtroom behind. Inside, the judge's private office was less imposing than the bench from which he usually ruled. Stacks of case files leaned precariously on a credenza. Diplomas and certificates lined the wall in carefully arranged frames. A faint scent of polish would mix with stale coffee. It was meant to be a sanctuary, a space where Judge Richard Callahan could retreat and reinforce the image of authority he carried like armor. But today, the sanctuary betrayed him. The silence inside was thick, suffocating, and it belonged not to him, but to the two federal agents who entered without ceremony. Michelle Carter did not sit. Neither did Agent Rollins. They remained standing just inside the threshold, their presence measured, deliberate, as though the walls themselves needed to understand this was no casual visit. Callahan gestured toward two chairs with a tight flick of his wrist, a host pretending to offer hospitality he did not feel. "Please," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. They ignored the gesture. Michelle set a thin folder on his desk, the bureau seal stamped in faint blue at the corner. "For the record, Your Honor," she began, her tone steady. "This meeting is preliminary. It is not an interview under oath, nor a deposition. Its purpose is logistical only. You are advised not to answer substantive questions regarding conduct without counsel present. Do you understand?" The judge's jaw tightened. "I understand federal overreach when I see it," he replied. "You barge into my courtroom, interrupt my docket, humiliate the bench, and then instruct me like I am some rookie officer caught in a traffic stop. I will remind you, Agent Carter, that this is my court." "Correction," Rollins said smoothly, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "This is the people's court. You preside. You do not own it. That distinction is why we are here." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. Callahan's hand twitched toward the letter from the Department of Justice, still on his desk, as though clutching it might reassert control. But he didn't lift it. He only pressed his palm against the paper, grounding himself against the inevitable shift in power. Michelle did not soften. "Judge Callahan, your court has been identified in multiple complaints of discriminatory practice. Those complaints span more than 2 years. They reference not just defendants, but attorneys and court staff. They allege a pattern of conduct inconsistent with equal protection under the law. The Bureau is under obligation to investigate. That process begins here, today, with your acknowledgement." He laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Anonymous complaints. Disgruntled defendants looking for leniency. Overzealous attorneys playing the race card when their clients are guilty. I have seen it all before." Michelle's eyes did not waver. "The complaints are not anonymous. Some names are redacted to protect ongoing proceedings, but many are not. They include testimony from staff members who still work in this courthouse. An investigation is not new. My presence today was not the beginning. It was a continuation." The judge's hand curled into a fist on the desk. He opened his mouth to reply, but Rollins spoke first, cutting through the tension. "We are not here to debate. We are here to inform you of your obligations. Preservation of records, non-interference with witnesses, cooperation with federal directives. If you comply, this remains an orderly process. If you resist, obstruction will be noted." Callahan stood suddenly, his chair scraping back. "Do you know who I am connected to?" His voice rose, no longer polished, now edged with desperation masquerading as defiance. "I have allies in the State House. I have colleagues on the appellate bench. I have friends in Washington. You think you can stroll in here and make demands without consequence? You are mistaken." Michelle took a step forward, closing the distance. She was calm, but her words carried the weight of iron. "We are not here because of your friends. We are here because of your actions. And if those actions withstand scrutiny, then you will remain on the bench. But if they do not, no ally will protect you from accountability. That is the law. That is the record. And that is the truth." The judge's face flushed crimson. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. His breath came heavy, uneven. Then, as though realizing how much he had revealed in that outburst, he forced his tone back into something resembling composure. "Fine," he said, lowering himself back into his chair. "Send your subpoenas. Question whomever you like. You will find nothing but a judge doing his duty." Michelle did not respond. She let the silence speak, stretching again until it grew unbearable. She knew silence could be sharper than cross-examination. They could peel away the bravado men like Callahan wore like armor. And it worked. He shifted under her gaze, straightening papers that did not need straightening, avoiding her eyes by pretending to read a document he had already memorized. Finally, Rollins broke the silence, her voice clipped and professional. "We will schedule staff interviews beginning tomorrow morning. Notices will be served this afternoon. Counsel for the court will receive coordination from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Do you have any objections to providing a secure conference room here on site?" Callahan bristled, but the trap was already set. If he refused, it would look like obstruction. If he agreed, it would signal compliance. He gritted his teeth. "You will have access to the jury deliberation room. It is secure." "Noted." Rollins replied, jotting it down without inflection. That will suffice. Michelle closed the folder on his desk. Then we are finished for today. Thank you for your cooperation. The final word was deliberate, a blade wrapped in velvet. She turned toward the door, Rollins beside her. The sergeant who had escorted them earlier opened it silently, and they stepped into the corridor once more. The hallway was quieter now. The earlier buzz of gossip had dulled into whispers carried off into corners, as though the walls themselves had begun keeping secrets. Clerks and assistants moved quickly, their eyes averted, yet every one of them felt the shift in air. For years, this courthouse had moved to the rhythm of Judge Callahan's authority. Now that rhythm faltered. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like a train that shuddered slightly on its tracks. Michelle walked with unhurried steps, her expression unreadable. Rollins spoke low beside her. He is rattled. You got under his skin. Michelle's reply was calm, almost distant. I was not trying to. The truth unsettles people when they have spent years avoiding it. Outside, the spring air hit them fresh and sharp. Reporters loitered near the courthouse steps, sensing a story without yet knowing its shape. Microphones twitched in their direction, but Michelle walked past without acknowledgement. This was not the time. Not yet. Her silence here served a different purpose. Not confront, but protect the integrity of what was unfolding. Back inside his chambers, Judge Callahan sat alone, staring at the letter on his desk. His hand hovered over his phone. He considered the names he might call, the allies he might summon, the favors he might cash in. But none of them changed the fact that 2 federal agents had stood in his office, spoken with authority greater than his own, and left without bending once. He clenched his fist, the silence pressing around him until it felt like the walls themselves accused him. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Callahan was not sure if his courtroom still belonged to him. The following morning, the courthouse carried a different pulse. People arrived earlier than usual, whispering in hallways, eyes darting to the elevators where 2 federal agents had been seen the day before. Clerks clutched their folders tighter. Attorneys hushed their conversations when passing through security. And even the deputies at the entrance scanned the faces of visitors more carefully, as to try and guess who might be part of the widening investigation. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Michelle Carter entered quietly, her stride calm, deliberate, with the same poise she had shown the day before. She was dressed in a dark suit this time, no longer blending into the background, but standing unmistakably as an agent of authority. She carried a slim portfolio under one arm and nothing else. The sergeant from the day before met her near the stairwell, his posture stiff, his voice low. Agent Carter, the conference room you requested has been secured. Staff have been notified of interview times. Thank you, Sergeant, Michelle said. Keep access limited. Only those scheduled should enter. Yes, ma'am, he replied, already turning to relay orders to his deputies. The first scheduled interview was with a clerk named Angela Hayes, a woman in her late 20s with auburn hair tied back in a loose bun. Angela entered the conference room nervously, her hands twisting the strap of her bag. She glanced once at Michelle, then at the tape recorder set neatly in the center of the table, and sat down. Her voice trembled at first. Am I protected if I speak? I mean, if Judge Callahan finds out. Michelle leaned forward, her tone steady but soft. Ms. Hayes, everything you say here is protected under federal procedure. Retaliation against a cooperating witness is itself a federal violation. You are not alone in this. Do you understand? Angela nodded, though her eyes still carried hesitation. She exhaled slowly and began. It's not always what he says directly. Sometimes it's the way he talks to certain people. The sarcasm, the looks. If a defendant is black, or if a public defender is a woman of color, the tone changes. He interrupts more. He dismisses motions faster. And then there are the jokes he makes, not in open court but in chambers. Comment about the usual crowd, or another lost cause from the South Side. We've heard it. We've all heard it. Michelle let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of those words to settle before asking the next question. Have you ever seen these comments influence a ruling or a sentence? Angela's hands gripped tighter around the strap. Yes, Too many times. Probation denied when others got it. Maximum sentences for minor violations. And always a different tone depending on who was standing before him. It's like he already knew how he'd rule before the arguments even started. Michelle glanced at Rollins, who was seated at the far end of the table, taking notes. Rollins gave a slight nod, confirming the statement would be cross-referenced with existing case files. Michelle then asked, "Has anyone ever filed a formal complaint?" Angela shook her head quickly. "We were afraid. Judges here, they're untouchable. Complaints disappear. People lose their jobs. We just stayed quiet." Her voice cracked slightly at the end. Michelle closed the portfolio gently. "You've done the right thing today. What you share will be protected, and it will matter." Angela nodded again, this time with a hint of relief softening her shoulders. When Angela left, 2 more staff members followed. A bailiff, older and seasoned, admitted that he'd been ordered more than once to keep an eye on certain spectators, always young black men, while ignoring others who behaved disruptively but looked different. A stenographer confessed that transcripts were occasionally altered at Callahan's request, small omissions or corrections that softened his harsher words. Each interview added another layer, another weight pressing down on the fragile structure of the judge's authority. By noon, Michelle had collected hours of testimony, each statement carefully logged and protected. Rollins leaned back in her chair during a break, stretching her neck. This is bigger than just his temper. This is systemic. He shaped a culture in this courthouse. Michelle tapped her pen against the portfolio, her eyes distant. Cultures collapse when they're documented. People can ignore whispers, but they can't ignore records. While Michelle gathered testimonies, Judge Callahan was pacing his chambers. His phone pressed his ear. His voice, though low, carried an edge of panic. "You don't understand," he muttered. "They're building something. They brought a second agent today. They've spoken to my clerks, my bailiffs. They're looking for patterns." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "I don't care about patience. I need leverage. Someone must know someone in the Bureau, someone who can slow this down." Another pause. His voice hardened. "Then make the call. I don't care how." But even as he plotted, the courthouse whispered around him. Attorneys traded rumors in the hallways. Defendants spoke in hushed tones about finally being heard. Reporters lingered outside longer than usual, their notebooks ready. Sensing the story was growing larger by the hour. In the late afternoon, Michelle requested access to archive case files. She and Rollins were escorted to a storage room where cardboard boxes stretched in rows, each filled with transcripts sensing orders and notes. Dust clung to the air as they opened the first box. Michelle slipped on gloves and began to leaf through the papers. Within minutes, patterns emerged. Cases with nearly identical charges, yet vastly different outcomes. Sentences harsher for defendants of color, leniency more frequent for others. A disparity so clear it needed no interpretation. Rollins held up a file. This defendant, first offense, minor possession. He got 18 months. She opened another. Similar case, different defendant, probation. She laid them side by side, the contrast undeniable. Michelle photographed the files methodically, each click of the camera echoing in the small room. "The weight of words," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Not just insults, not just tone. It's how those words shape outcomes, how they decide lives." They worked for hours, cataloging evidence until the light outside dimmed and the courthouse grew quieter. When they finally emerged, arms full of copied files, the building seemed changed. The portraits of past judges that lined the corridor no longer looked dignified. They looked watchful, complicit in silence. As they left, a young public defender caught up to them on the steps. "Agents," she said softly, glancing around before continuing. "If you want more proof, talk to the community. They've kept records too, informal ones. Families share stories, compare sentences. They've been waiting for someone to listen." Michelle gave her a card. "Tell them we are listening." The defender nodded, relief flickering across her tired face, and disappeared back inside. That night, as Michelle reviewed the day's notes in her hotel room, She reflected on the voices she had heard. Each one carried the weight of years. Years of being silenced, overlooked, diminished. She thought of Angela Hayes twisting the strap of her bag, of the stenographer whispering about altered transcripts, of the bailiff who finally admitted what he had been ordered to do. The investigation was no longer abstract. It had faces, names, stories. It had weight. And Judge Callahan, for the first time in his career, was beginning to feel it pressed down on him. The courthouse cafeteria had never been a place for secrets. Its tables, coated in the gloss of 1,000 hurried lunches, usually carried the buzz of clerks, attorneys, and officers exchanging gossip and grievances over lukewarm coffee. But in the days following Michelle's arrival, the buzz had turned into murmurs. Conversations broke off mid-sentence when she entered, glances shifted, and voices dropped into conspiratorial tones. The air felt different, charged with the uneasy awareness that words spoken too freely could end up on record. Michelle didn't mind. Silence was often more revealing than noise. On the third morning of interviews, she entered the small conference room set aside for her work and found a young woman waiting already. Perched on the edge of a chair as if prepared to flee at any moment, she was introduced as Marcia Caldwell, an assistant judicial secretary who had worked under Judge Callahan for 5 years. Her hands clutched the folder so tightly the edges had begun to curl. "Agent Carter," she said in a hushed tone, "I don't know if I should be here. I've seen what happens to people who talk. They don't last." Michelle gestured gently toward the chair. "You've lasted 5 years. That tells me you know how to endure. Now you have a chance to be heard." Marcia hesitated, then slid the folder across the table. Inside were copies of internal emails, memoranda, and handwritten notes she had quietly saved. Some carried instructions to tighten restrictions on certain defendants, language vague enough to seem procedural but unmistakably patterned when placed side by side. Others were scrawled comments Callahan had made in margins, dismissing requests from public defenders with phrases like "waste of time" or "another sob story." "I kept these because I thought maybe one day," Marcia's voice trailed off. "But I never thought anyone would actually come asking." Michelle studied the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. "You've done something very few would have had the courage to do," she said. "This helps us establish not just behavior, but intention. That matters." Marcia's shoulders eased a fraction, but fear still lingered in her eyes. "He has ways of making people's lives miserable. Not always directly. Sometimes it's just suddenly being passed over for a raise, or having your desk moved, or being left out of meetings. Little things, but enough to remind you who's in charge." Michelle leaned forward slightly, her tone precise. "Those little things are power, and the abuse of power leaves traces. You've given us those traces." When Marcia left, she did so with a weight lifted, though she looked over her shoulder as though expecting someone to stop her. Michelle watched her go, then turned to Rollins, who was cataloging the documents. "This isn't just about rulings," Rollins said quietly. "It's about control. He's ruled this courthouse like it's his private kingdom." Michelle nodded. Kingdoms fall when the walls start speaking. Later that day, Michelle met with a public defender named Jonathan Fields. He was in his early 40s, his suit wrinkled, his briefcase overstuffed with case files. His reputation was that of a fighter, often overwhelmed by the caseload, but relentless in defending his clients. He sat down heavily, exhaustion in his eyes, but also a fire that hadn't been extinguished. "I'll be honest with you, Agent Carter," he began. "I've thought about leaving this courthouse more times than I can count. But leaving means abandoning the clients who can't afford better representation, and staying means dealing with them. What have you observed?" Michelle asked. Fields leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Bias disguised as procedure. He's smart about it. He doesn't always say things outright in the courtroom, but he sets the tone, interrupts defense arguments, gives prosecutors more leeway. Sometimes it's in the scheduling. Our cases get pushed to the end of the docket, dragging on for months, while others sail through. My clients wait in jail for hearings that could have been resolved in weeks." He shook his head. "Justice delayed is justice denied, and he knows it." Michelle listened carefully, noting each example. "Do you have records to support these patterns?" Fields gave a tired smile. "I've been keeping my own logs." Dates, rulings, comments. I knew someday I'd need them. I'll get them to you. When he stood to leave, Michelle stopped him with a final question. Why keep fighting here if it costs you so much? He paused, looking down at his worn briefcase. Because if I leave, he wins. And people like my clients lose. I can't let that happen. His words echoed long after he walked out of the room. By evening, Michelle had gathered enough testimonies to fill multiple files. The voices were consistent, the patterns undeniable. Yet, for every person willing to speak, there were others who avoided her gaze in hallways, who shook their heads when asked to step inside, who whispered that it was too dangerous. These were the silenced voices, the ones beaten down by years of quiet intimidation, too fearful to put their truth on record. But Michelle knew that silence was also evidence. The refusal to speak spoke volumes about the climate Callahan had cultivated. Fear itself was a pattern, and patterns told stories. That night, Michelle sat in her hotel room again, reviewing the day's notes. The stack of files had grown heavier, and with it, the weight of responsibility. She thought of Marcia clutching her folder, Jonathan dragging his briefcase, Angela twisting her bag strap. They had carried these burdens quietly for years. Now those burdens were being laid bare. Across town, Judge Callahan sat in a darkened study, a glass of bourbon untouched on the table beside him. His phone buzzed with messages, allies checking in, offering reassurances, promising to make calls. But reassurance rang hollow when he thought of those agents walking his halls, collecting words that had once been safely buried. For the first time, his silence was not power, it was vulnerability. And Michelle knew, as she closed her files of the night, that the silenced voices were beginning to find sound. By the end of the week, the courthouse had ceased to function in its usual rhythm. The docket, once a steady flow of hearings and motions, now sputtered with interruptions, delays, and rescheduling. Staff whispered that the judge's temper had worsened, his outbursts in chambers sharper, his patience shorter. But what unsettled them most was not his behavior. It was the presence of the two federal agents who moved through the building with quiet purpose, gathering fragments of truth that Callahan had once believed too small to matter. The shift did not escape the attorneys who practiced there daily. In the attorneys' lounge, the atmosphere was electric. Some were emboldened by the investigation, their voices louder as they swapped stories about rulings that had long bothered them. Others were cautious, choosing silence over speculation, fearful of being seen as disloyal to a judge who might still wield influence. A young prosecutor, eager but nervous, leaned toward an older colleague. "Do you think they'll actually remove him?" he whispered. The older attorney only shook his head, muttering, "Men like him don't go down easy." Michelle, meanwhile, pressed forward. Each day she returned to the conference room, her interviews pulling threads from the courthouse tapestry. With every thread, the pattern of misconduct became clearer. But patterns weren't enough. She needed proof that reached beyond the building, proof that tied Callahan to decisions influenced by something darker than arrogance. That opportunity came sooner than expected. On a gray Tuesday morning, as Michelle reviewed case files in the storage room, a defense attorney approached her quietly. His name was Paul Daniels, a man known for cautious strategies and careful words. He glanced around before speaking. "Agent Carter, there's something you need to know," he said, his voice low. "Callahan has friends outside this courthouse. He's been making calls since you arrived, trying to spin this, make it look like you're targeting him personally." Michelle set down the file in her hand. "What kind of calls?" "To legislators, other judges, maybe even someone in Washington," Daniels replied. "I heard him in chambers yesterday, saying the Bureau was out to get him, that you were making it personal. He's trying to rally support before this grows too big." Rollins, who had been cataloging documents nearby, stepped closer. "Do you have any proof of these calls?" Daniels hesitated. "No recordings, but I know one of the clerks who overheard a conversation. She's too afraid to come forward, but if you push, she might." Michelle nodded slowly. "Give me her name. We'll handle the rest." The attorney scribbled it on a scrap of paper and slid it across the table before slipping out as quietly as he had arrived. That afternoon, Michelle and Rollins interviewed the clerk, a soft-spoken woman named Lydia. Her fear was evident. But under the assurance of federal protection, she admitted to overhearing Callahan on the phone. He said Agent Carter was on some kind of vendetta, she recalled. He was angry. He said he'd call in favors. He even mentioned names, people I didn't recognize, but he said they owed him. Michelle kept her tone measured. Did he mention anything about interfering with the investigation directly? Lydia shook her head. Not directly. But he said he'd make sure this whole thing got buried before it reached the headlines. The words carried weight. They were not enough to prove obstruction yet, but they revealed intent. A man fighting to protect himself by bending the system in his favor. Michelle documented every detail, her pen steady against the page. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the rumors had begun to spread. Reporters who had once lingered without clear leads now sniffed stories with sharper interest. Small pieces began appearing in local papers. Federal agents seen at Fulton Courthouse. Sources suggest inquiry into judicial conduct. Though vague, the articles carried enough spark to ignite speculation. By the end of the week, the courthouse was swarmed each morning with journalists waiting for a statement that no one was authorized to give. Callahan grew visibly unsettled. During one hearing, he lashed out at a defense attorney for filing what he called a ridiculous motion, his voice echoing louder than usual. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, and though he continued the proceeding, the damage was done. Eyes were watching him differently now, not with the usual deference, but with suspicion. Even the prosecutors, who had once leaned on his stern rulings, began to distance themselves, careful not to appear too aligned. One afternoon, in a rare quiet moment, Callahan confronted Michelle in the hallway. His robe hung heavy on his shoulders, his face red with restrained fury. "You think you won because you spooked a few clerks and lawyers," he hissed under his breath, his words sharp enough to slice. "This is my courthouse, my bench. You're an outsider who doesn't understand how things work here." Michelle met his gaze without flinching. "Justice doesn't belong to you, Judge. It belongs to the people, and they deserve better than a courtroom where fear speaks louder than fairness." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not just anger, but fear. He turned sharply and disappeared back into chambers, his footsteps heavy against the marble. By the end of the day, the reaction within the courthouse was undeniable. Staff avoided his chambers unless summoned. Attorneys whispered openly about his conduct. The once unshakable aura of authority that cloaked Judge Richard Callahan was beginning to fracture. And Michelle knew, as she left the courthouse that evening, that the cracks were spreading faster than he could seal them. The reaction of the court was no longer confined to whispers. It would become the very foundation of his unraveling. The investigation had already pierced the walls of the courthouse, but Michelle knew that to understand the full scale of Callahan's influence, she needed to look beyond those walls. Patterns in rulings whispered intimidation, and phone calls to allies painted part of the picture. The larger question was, who had benefited from his decisions, and who had helped to maintain power? On Thursday morning, she and Rollins met with Assistant U.S. Attorney David Greer in a secure conference room at the Federal Building downtown. Greer was methodical, a man who valued precision over theatrics, and he listened carefully as they laid out the testimonies, the case disparities, and the hints of external pressure. When Michelle finished, he tapped the pen against the edge of his notebook. "What you're describing isn't just misconduct," he said finally. "It's potential collusion. If Callahan is tied to political or business interests that influences rulings, we're not looking at isolated abuses. We're looking at corruption under color of law." Michelle leaned back slightly, her expression calm but resolute. "Then we expand the scope. We follow the money, the favors, the rulings that don't make sense unless you trace them to someone else's hand." Greer nodded. "Start with cases involving land development and contracts. Those often leave paper trails. And if you find anything suggesting quid pro quo, we move to indictments." By that afternoon, Michelle and Rollins had requested access to a decade of case records related to property disputes, zoning conflicts, and financial crimes that had passed through Callahan's courtroom. Patterns emerged quickly. Developers with ties to certain political donors had consistently walked away with favorable rulings. Minority-owned businesses, however, had lost challenges even when the evidence leaned in their favor. In one file, Rollins found a particularly troubling case, A black-owned construction company had sued a larger firm for breach of contract, providing clear documentation. Yet the case had been dismissed at an early stage. The larger firm, a known donor to a political action committee that had supported Callahan's campaign for the bench years earlier. Michelle studied the papers, her jaw tightening. This isn't just bias. This is payback. The deeper they dug, the darker the connections became. They traced a string of rulings tied to figures with political clout in the State House. Several of those figures had themselves been accused of discriminatory practices in other arenas: education boards, housing commissions, even policing contracts. It was a web, and Callahan was not just a node in it. He was a gatekeeper, ensuring certain interests were protected while others were crushed. The breakthrough came when a confidential source reached out. It was late evening, and Michelle received a call on her secure line. The voice on the other end was male, cautious, and distorted slightly by the static of a burner phone. "You don't know me," the caller said, "but I've seen how this judge operates. And I know who he talks to when no one's supposed to hear." Michelle's tone was steady. "Who am I speaking to?" "Someone who used to handle his finances." The man replied, "He thought I'd stay quiet, but I've seen enough. He's funneled favors through shell companies, contracts, donations, kickbacks. Look into his ties with Holloway Development Group. Follow the rulings, and you'll see what I mean." Before Michelle could press for more, the line went dead. The next day, she subpoenaed records connected to Holloway Development. What they found confirmed the tip. Several favorable rulings had allowed the company to bypass zoning restrictions, displacing low-income residents in predominantly black neighborhoods. The rulings had been justified within legal reasoning, often contradicting precedent. Yet each time, Callahan had been the presiding judge. Rollins exhaled sharply as she pieced through the files. He's not just biased. He's complicit. He's part of a machine that profits from discrimination. Michelle photographed the documents methodically, and now we have a direction. If Holloway Development benefited, we need to find out what they gave in return. As they worked, word of the investigation began to spread further. Anonymous letters arrived at the federal building, some offering support, others laced with veiled threats. One envelope contained nothing but a newspaper clipping of Callahan's face, circled in red ink. Another carried a typed message: "Back off, or you'll regret it." Michelle studied the threats without reaction, slipping them into an evidence folder. She knew resistance meant she was getting closer to the truth. Meanwhile, Callahan's behavior grew more erratic. He held closed-door meetings with select allies, his voice raised loud enough that clerks outside could hear fragments. "They can't do this to me. I protected this courthouse for years. They'll regret crossing me." Rumors swirled that he was considering stepping down temporarily to deflect pressure, but those who knew him best doubted he would surrender so easily. In private, Callahan reached out to political contacts, begging for support. One legislator promised to issue a public statement dismissing the investigation as overreach, but the words never came. The climate had shifted too quickly. Few were willing to tie themselves publicly to a man under federal scrutiny. Callahan was discovering the limits of his influence, limits he had long pretended did not exist. Michelle, however, was discovering something else, a network of power that extended far beyond one courtroom. The judge was not an isolated figure. He was a symptom of a larger system, one that relied on silence, complicity, and connections hidden beneath the surface. Late one night, as she reviewed her notes, Michelle wrote a single line in her journal. "This is not just about one judge. It's about everyone who let him rule unchecked." The dangerous connections were no longer rumors. They were threads woven tightly into the fabric of power, and Michelle knew pulling them would unravel more than Callahan's career. It would expose an entire system to the light, and she was ready for the fight that was coming. The air outside the courthouse that Monday morning was different. Reporters no longer lingered at a distance, waiting for scraps of rumor. They lined the steps in clusters, microphones and cameras ready, hungry for movement. For days, whispers had filled the press. A federal inquiry into a sitting judge, allegations of misconduct, hints of deeper corruption. Now, the expectation had grown into a storm. Everyone knew something was coming. No one knew when. Inside, The tension was even thicker. The docket was delayed, and staff moved nervously through the corridors. Attorneys exchanged terse greetings, their eyes flicking toward the double doors of courtroom. The usual rhythm of justice, case after case, voice after voice, had given way to a silence that felt like anticipation before a verdict. Michelle entered through a side door, accompanied by Rollins and 2 other federal agents. She carried a black binder tucked under her arm, the weight of it more symbolic than physical. It held documentation, transcripts, and rulings that laid out the story of a judge who had twisted justice for a personal bias and political favor. Today was not about whispers in hallways or closed-door meetings. Today was about bringing it into the open. Judge Callahan took the bench at 10 o'clock sharp, his robe draped over his shoulders like armor. His face was stern, his jaw tight, his voice clipped as he called the court to order. He knew the agents were in the room. He had seen them enter. He also knew what they carried, and though he tried to mask it, his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The clerk read the first case of the morning, but before proceedings could begin, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Greer rose from his seat. He addressed the court with the steady confidence of a man who knew the weight of his words. "Your Honor," he said, "the United States respectfully moves to address a matter of immediate importance prior to today's docket. This motion is supported by federal statute and is tied to an ongoing investigation into the integrity of these proceedings." The room froze. Defense attorneys leaned forward. Prosecutors exchanged wary glances. Callahan's hand tightened on his gavel. "Mr. Greer," he said, his tone icy, "this is my courtroom. If you have business, you file it properly. You do not interrupt proceedings." Greer did not flinch. "Your Honor, with respect, this is filed, and it is filed under seal. What I request today is acknowledgement on the record of documents that directly implicate this court's operations. Federal agents are present to support this motion." Michelle rose then, stepping forward with a black binder. She placed it gently on the prosecution table, flipping it open to reveal stamped exhibits. Her voice carried clearly. "The Bureau has compiled evidence of patterns inconsistent with equal protection under the law, as well as communications suggesting interference with due process. These documents include rulings, transcripts, and testimony from multiple witnesses. The United States requests immediate judicial recognition of this material." A ripple of sound swept through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, even though no recording devices were allowed. The defense attorney at the front whispered something to his client, his face pale. Callahan's composure cracked. He slammed the gavel down. "This is outrageous. You are undermining the dignity of this court. You have no authority to parade your accusations here." Michelle did not raise her voice. She only spoke with the calm precision that had carried her through every tense moment of the investigation. "Your Honor, dignity does not erase accountability. Authority does not erase responsibility. The record will show both." For the first time, murmurs from the gallery rose loud enough to compete with the bench. People shifted in their seats, some nodding subtly, others simply wide-eyed at the spectacle unfolding before them. Greer continued, "Your Honor, the United States moves for judicial recusal, effective immediately, until the investigation concludes. Your presence on the bench compromises the integrity of every case heard in this courtroom." The words landed like a hammer. Recusal. It was not yet removal, but it was a direct strike at Callahan's authority. His face reddened. "You presume," he hissed, leaning forward, "to tell me I cannot sit in judgment in my own court?" Michelle stepped closer to the rail, her gaze locked on him. "No one is above the law, Judge, not even the one who holds the gavel." The silence that followed was suffocating. Callahan gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles pale, his breath sharp. He opened his mouth, but before he could respond, Greer lifted a hand. "For the record," he said firmly, "the Department of Justice has filed a motion. A federal order is pending. The U.S. Marshal Service has been notified." The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, the shuffle of bodies leaning forward to catch every word. Callahan struck the gavel again, shouting, "Silence in the court. This proceeding is over." But his words carried no authority now. They sounded hollow, desperate. 2 uniformed marshals entered quietly through the side door, their presence undeniable. They did not move toward him yet, but their very appearance shifted the balance in the room. The aura of untouchable power that had cloaked him for years was dissolving under the weight of federal authority. Callahan's eyes darted from the marshals to Michelle, then to Greer. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the courtroom no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the record, and the record was turning against him. Michelle closed the binder with a soft thud that echoed louder than any gavel strike. "The people are watching," she said quietly, but every ear in the room heard it. Justice will not be silenced. The judge sat back, his robe heavy, his breath uneven. Around him, the courtroom no longer held deference. It held expectation. The confrontation he had tried to avoid was now public, undeniable, and irreversible. And as the marshal stepped closer, the world outside the courthouse prepared to hear the story that would shape the foundations of his legacy. The courthouse had never witnessed a morning like this. Word of the confrontation spread faster than the walls could contain it. By noon, the corridors were clogged with whispers, phones buzzing with hurried messages to offices downtown. Attorneys who hadn't been present pressed colleagues for details. Staff repeated fragments of what they'd overheard, the story twisting and magnified with each retelling. Outside, the reporters waiting on the steps sensed a tremor and sharpened their pens for the aftershock. But the focus remained on the courtroom. After the marshals had entered, Callahan had not been removed. Not yet. Instead, the clerk announced an abrupt recess. Spectators poured into the hallway, some shaking their heads, others wide-eyed with disbelief. Inside, Michelle and her team stayed put, the binder of evidence closed but unmoving, a silent reminder of the weight it carried. Judge Callahan retreated into his chambers, slamming the door behind him. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the certificates on his wall. The gold seals and polished frames mocked him now. They were no longer shields of legitimacy, but relics of a power he could feel slipping away. He lowered himself into his chair, gripping the armrest until his knuckles burned. A knock broke the silence. His clerk stepped in, hesitant. "Your Honor, the U.S. Attorney's Office has filed for emergency review before the state's Judicial Oversight Board. They're requesting an immediate order of suspension pending the federal investigation." Callahan's face reddened. Suspension? The word came out like a hiss. This is political theater. They want to make me a scapegoat. The clerk didn't answer, only set the printed motion on his desk. "The board convenes within the hour," she said softly, before slipping out again. Across the hall, Michelle waited with Greer and Rollins. The marshals stood at the back of the room, silent but steady, their presence a living reminder of federal reach. Greer leaned toward Michelle. "The Oversight Board will side with us. They can't risk the appearance of ignoring this. Once the order comes down, Callahan will be stripped of authority immediately." Michelle nodded but didn't relax. She knew better than to celebrate too early. "He won't go quietly," she said. "We need to prepare for resistance." She was right. When the board decision arrived just before 1 o'clock, it came with unmistakable clarity. Judge Richard Callahan was to be suspended from the bench effective immediately, barred from presiding over any case until the investigation concluded. The order was delivered to the clerk's desk, stamped and sealed, its authority unquestionable. When Callahan re-entered the courtroom, the paper already waited on his bench. He picked it up, scanned the words, and for the first time in his career, his authority was not absolute. It had been clipped, pared down to nothing more than a man in a robe with no gavel to wield. His hand trembled as he set the document aside. The gallery held its breath. The silence felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Callahan looked out at the rows of faces, attorneys, defendants, staff, and saw no loyalty left in their eyes. Some avoided his gaze. Others looked at him with quiet satisfaction, as though years of injustice had finally tilted toward balance. Greer rose again. "Your Honor, or rather, Judge Callahan," he said with careful emphasis, "the order from the Judicial Oversight Board is clear. You are suspended effective immediately. The United States Marshal Service is authorized to enforce this order. Please step down from the bench." Callahan's face hardened. "You dare address me like a criminal? After decades of service? After upholding the law when no one else would?" Michelle stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but each word cut sharp. Upholding the law does not mean bending it to your prejudice. Service is not a shield against accountability. Step down, Judge. For a moment, defiance blazed in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to rail against them, to thunder as he always had from the bench. But no words came. His power had lived in the illusion of control, in the silence of those who feared him. Now, in the open, stripped of that silence, his authority evaporated. The marshals stepped forward, not aggressively, not forcefully, just close enough that everyone understood what would happen if he resisted. Callahan's breath came heavy. His shoulders slumped, and finally he rose. The gavel, untouched since the morning, sat on the bench before him. For years it had been an extension of his voice. Now it was nothing but wood. He left it there. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the room. As he passed Michelle, his glare burned with fury, but beneath it lingered something else. The recognition that he had been undone not by chaos, but by order, by the very system he had twisted. The gallery stirred as he walked out, escorted by marshals. Some people exhaled audibly, as if holding their breath until he was gone. A few clapped quietly before stopping themselves, unsure whether celebration was allowed in such a space. But the energy had shifted permanently. Greer addressed the court. Proceedings in this courtroom are adjourned until a new judge is appointed. All pending matters will be reassigned. His words carried the steady weight of finality. Michelle closed her binder and straightened. She didn't smile, didn't relax. She knew this was only the turning point, not the end. Callahan's removal was a blow, but the larger web remained. She turned to Rollins. We need to secure the rest of his records before anyone else tries to bury them. Every email, every phone log, every case file connected to his rulings. If he was part of a network, we follow to the source. Rollins nodded. He's out of power, but his friends won't abandon him quietly. We've rattled a cage that holds more than one predator. Michelle looked around the courtroom one last time. The stained wood, the portraits on the walls, the seal above the bench, all had borne witness to a reckoning that many thought would never come. But the reckoning was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger. As she stepped out into the hallway, the reporters surged forward, voices overlapping in a storm of questions. She did not stop. This was not the time for sound bites. The work was not yet done, and she would not allow the spectacle to eclipse the substance. Behind her, the doors to the courtroom closed, marking the end of an era. Ahead of her, the fight stretched wider, deeper, more dangerous. But Michelle Carter was ready. The judicial turning point had come, and with it, the promise that silence no longer ruled Fulton County's halls of justice. The suspension of Judge Callahan spread through Atlanta like a spark through dry grass. By evening, it was no longer confined to hushed courthouse corridors or whispered conversations among attorneys. It was on the evening news, in headlines across the state, in posts shared thousands of times online. Anchors spoke with careful gravity. A sitting Fulton County judge suspended amid allegations of misconduct and federal investigation. For the first time in decades, people outside the courthouse walls were asking whether justice had been poisoned at its source. Michelle Carter sat behind a podium the following morning, flanked by Assistant U.S. Attorney Greer and Agent Rollins. The press conference had been carefully planned, the talking points vetted by the Bureau and the Department of Justice. The room was packed. Cameras crowding the front, microphones extended like a field of antennae. The anticipation was palpable, the reporters restless, each waiting for the first statement. Greer spoke briefly, outlining the suspension, the role of the Oversight Board, and the federal government's commitment to ensuring due process. He kept his language tight, legal, safe, but when Michelle stepped forward, the room shifted. She was not a politician. She was not a lawyer. She was a black woman who had walked into a courthouse, endured public humiliation, and revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. She adjusted the microphone and began. For too long, too many people have walked into a courtroom believing that justice was blind, only to find that it saw them differently because of their race, their gender, or their means. What happened in Fulton County is not an isolated story. It is part of a larger truth, that power unchecked can corrupt, and silence can wound just as deeply as words. The room was still. The The reporters who usually shouted questions stayed quiet, listening. Michelle's voice did not rise, but it carried a force beyond volume. I stood in that courtroom as an observer, and I was dismissed because I did not fit the image of who was expected to belong there. Many women, many people of color, have felt that same dismissal, not always with words, but with looks, with tone, with the weight of decisions made before they even speak. Yesterday was not about me. Yesterday was about accountability. And today, I want every person who has ever felt small in a place meant to protect them to know your voice matters. Your presence matters. And no one has the right to silence you. For a moment after she finished, the silence was heavier than applause. Then the reporters erupted with questions, voices overlapping. She answered a few, carefully measured. Yes, the investigation was ongoing. Yes, further inquiries might reveal broader misconduct. No, she would not speculate on the outcome of judicial proceedings. But one question cut through, asked by a young journalist at the back. Agent Carter, what do you say to the people who still don't believe change is possible in a system this entrenched? Michelle met his gaze. I say change begins when people stop accepting silence as a cost of survival. And yesterday, silence was broken. That quote made headlines within hours. It was replayed on local stations, clipped for national broadcasts, shared online with captions that turned it into a rallying cry. Community leaders in Atlanta cited her words at town halls. Civil rights organizations amplified them in newsletters. Parents quoted them to their children. For once, the story was not just about misconduct. It was about the power of being seen and the courage to demand accountability. But with visibility came resistance. Opinion pieces appeared, accusing the Bureau of overreach, suggesting Michelle was making the case personal. Callahan's allies whispered to sympathetic journalists that she had staged her confrontation for attention. Some radio hosts painted her as a disruptor who wanted to tear down the system instead of working within it. Michelle read these criticisms late one night in her hotel room, the glow of the laptop reflecting off her tired eyes. She felt the weight of them, not because they surprised her, but because they were so familiar. For every step forward, there were always voices insisting the step was a mistake. She closed the laptop gently, sat back, and let the silence of the room settle around her. The next morning, she went back to work. There were still files to review, witnesses to protect, trails of influence to follow. But now, when she walked into the courthouse, people looked at her differently, some with gratitude, some with resentment, but no longer with dismissal. The silence had shifted. One afternoon, she stopped in the hallway when Angela Hayes, the clerk who had first spoken to her, approached. Angela's voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "I saw your speech," she said. "You said silence was broken. That's true. People are talking now. Staff who never would have spoken before. They feel safer." Michelle gave a small nod. "That's the beginning, but it has to last beyond me. You all have to keep speaking." Angela hesitated, then said, "We will." It wasn't a promise of ease, but of intent, and that mattered. The following week, Michelle's words reached even further. A group of law students at a nearby university organized a forum on judicial accountability. Citing her press conference as inspiration, former defendants who had faced Callahan began contacting community organizations, sharing their stories publicly. What had begun as a federal investigation was becoming something larger, a public reckoning with the idea of fairness itself. And through it all, Michelle refused interviews with national outlets eager to paint her as a hero. She declined photo shoots, turned down profile pieces, avoided the spotlight whenever she could. Her focus remained on the work, on the voices that had been silenced for so long. Yet she could not escape the truth. Her presence had become a symbol, and symbols carried weight. That weight pressed on her in quiet moments. When the courthouse emptied and the noise died down, it pressed on her in the letters arriving from citizens across the state, thanking her for standing firm. It pressed on her in the stares of staff who now saw her as something more than an agent. They saw her as proof that resistance was possible. Michelle carried that weight not with pride, but with responsibility. She knew symbols faded, but the record did not. The truth, once spoken, could not be buried again. And as she prepared the next phase of the investigation, she reminded herself of the words she had spoken at the podium. Silence was broken. That meant the work could not stop now. The storm around Judge Richard Callahan did not pass quietly. His suspension was only the beginning. The investigation stretched deeper with every week. Federal subpoenas unearthed layers of correspondence and financial records that tied him to business interests and political allies who had long operated in the shadows. What began as scrutiny of one man's behavior was now exposing the anatomy of a system built to protect privilege and punish vulnerability. Michelle Carter was at the center of it, but she resisted the narrative of singular heroism that reporters tried to craft around her. To her, the story was not about one agent facing one judge. It was about dozens of clerks, attorneys, and defendants who had finally found their voices. It was about transcripts that revealed more than anyone had admitted. It was about lives altered by the weight of a gavel wielded unjustly. She carried that truth with her as the months unfolded. In the courthouse, a temporary judge was appointed to handle the backlog of cases. Almost immediately, the atmosphere shifted. Defense attorneys reported being heard more fully. Prosecutors adjusted their strategies, no longer able to lean on Callahan's predictable severity. Defendants who had expected nothing but scorn found hearings marked by procedure rather than prejudice. It was not perfection, no courtroom ever was, but it was change, and the staff felt it in their bones. Outside those walls, the community stirred. Town halls filled with residents eager to discuss judicial accountability. Nonprofit organizations began organizing workshops to help citizens understand their rights in court. Law schools added panels on systemic bias, inviting Michelle and other agents to speak. What had once been whispered in frustration was now openly debated, dissected, and slowly addressed. One evening, months after the confrontation, Michelle returned to Fulton County for a smaller, quieter meeting. It wasn't a press conference or a courtroom drama. It was a gathering in a community center, folding chairs arranged in a circle, coffee brewing in the back. Families who had once stood before Callahan were invited to share their experiences, not as evidence for a case, but as testimony for each other. An older woman with graying hair spoke first. Her son had been denied probation for a minor violation and spent nearly 2 years in prison as a result. He missed the birth of his daughter, she said softly. We tried to appeal, but no one listened. We thought that was just how it worked. Her voice cracked, but she continued. Now, no, it wasn't just him. No, it was a pattern. That gives me some peace. Because maybe it means change. A young man followed, his hands clenched tightly. I was told I'd get a fair hearing. Instead, I was called a liar before I even opened my mouth. I thought it was my fault. I thought I wasn't smart enough, respectful enough. But it wasn't me, it was the system. Michelle listened to every word. She did not interrupt, did not lecture, did not try to claim space. She simply bore witness, understanding that her presence was not to lead but to affirm. When the circle turned to her, she spoke quietly. The fight isn't over. What we uncovered was part of something larger. But it matters that you're speaking. It matters that these truths are shared. Justice is not built in one day or by one investigation. It is built every time someone refuses to be silenced. The room was still, the truth hanging heavy but not unbearable. For the first time in years, many of those families felt the weight shift from their shoulders to something collective, something carried together. Meanwhile, Callahan faced his own reckoning. The federal investigation concluded with multiple findings, evidence of discriminatory practices, corruption linked to development contracts, and obstruction of justice. His case was referred for a criminal prosecution. No longer a judge, he sat in the very kind of courtroom where he had once ruled, now a defendant with counsel at his side. The irony was not lost on anyone who had followed the story. For Michelle, the trial was not the climax. She attended some hearings, filed reports, and testified when required, but she did not linger on the spectacle. The work that mattered most to her was quieter, meeting with clerks who still feared retaliation, advising attorneys on how to report misconduct in the future, mentoring young agents who would carry investigations beyond her own. She had no illusions that one case would fix the system, but she believed in momentum, and momentum had been created. Months later, When national networks reached out again, offering exclusive interviews and glossy magazine spreads, Michelle declined once more. Instead, she returned to her routine assignments, traveling to other courthouses, other cities, listening for echoes of silence that needed to be broken. Her name might fade from headlines, but her work did not. In Fulton County, the courtroom where it all began was renovated during the interim. The wood panels were polished, the benches repaired, the portraits on the wall rotated to include more diverse figures from the county's legal history. It was cosmetic change, but symbolized something deeper, a recognition that the room had been a stage for reckoning and that it now carried a different kind of weight. On the first day the renovated courtroom reopened, Michelle visited quietly, slipping into a back row as a new judge took the bench. She watched as a young public defender argued passionately for a client, and the judge listened without interruption. It was a small moment, but it mattered. Michelle rose, stepped outside, and breathed the Atlanta air. She did not need applause or recognition. She knew the work would continue, in Fulton and beyond, carried by others who now believed change was possible. For many, she would always be remembered as the agent who walked into a courtroom, endured humiliation, and revealed the truth. But for Michelle Carter, the real legacy was quieter. She had not been just an agent of the FBI in that courtroom. She had been an agent of change. And in the long arc of justice, change was what mattered most.